They say that no publicity is bad publicity, and as long as you're getting the word out about yourself or your product, it doesn't really matter what the press is saying. While some would agree with that sentiment though, we're pretty sure there are a fair few video games whose names have been dragged through the mud who would probably tell you otherwise. For this list, we're taking a look at the games that have caused the biggest scandals over the years due to their less than savoury content. We won't be looking at loot box and microtransaction snafus, mostly because they're not all that interesting, nor will we be looking at any games that were clearly just setting out to upset people. Looking at you, JFK Reloaded. Fair warning before we get into it though, we will be touching on some sensitive subjects today, including but not limited to violence, murder and torture. So if you need to tap out now, we completely understand. The other fair warning is that we might not be able to show a lot of this on YouTube because, well, you know, it's YouTube. We'll see what we can get away with, I suppose. With that, I'm the wholly unscandalous Peter from TripleJump, scandal pending, and here are the 10 most controversial video games of all time. Number 10. Death Race. If you're not up on your video game history, you might assume that complaints about violence in video games have only surfaced since graphics have become good enough to properly depict it. But you'd be wrong. In fact, one of the earliest games to court controversy was 1976 title Death Race, which had folks clutching their pearls very tightly, let me tell you. In Death Race, players take control of a little pixelated car, and it's up to them to mow down the gremlins charging about the screen. When the gremlins die, they're replaced by little tombstones which must be avoided by the player, and the longer the game goes on, the harder it becomes due to all of said tombstones littering the screen. Though Death Race is incredibly tame by today's standards, concerned parents and special interest groups of the 70s were outraged. Associated Press reporter Wendy Walker, who, going by her name, I assume doesn't drive, penned an article on how violent the game was, and some even expressed concerns that it might cause people to get into real cars and start mowing down pedestrians, or gravestones, with reckless abandon. But let's put it like this, if something like Death Race is enough to get you committing vehicular homicide, I think the problem might be with you rather than the video games industry. Number 9. Wolfenstein 3D. Those of you who know your real-life history now, as opposed to video games history, will probably be aware that between 1939 and 1945, Germany, along with a handful of other countries, did a very, very bad thing. Keen for said bad thing to never happen again, Germany later implemented a bunch of laws that prohibit the use and/or distribution of symbols related to fascist and/or terrorist organizations, particularly those used by the Nazis. So, long story short, Germany didn't much care for Wolfenstein 3D. Despite the fact that the Nazis are portrayed as the baddies in Wolfenstein 3D, the game was banned outright, with censors taking offense to all of the Nazi symbolism included in the game, and the fact that Adolf Hitler himself was a boss that players had to fight. The rest of the world weren't super pleased with Wolfenstein 3D either, to be fair, and though it was only banned in Germany, plenty of other non-Germans were upset at all of the violence, gore, and Nazis. The good news for gamers in Germany is that Wolfenstein 3D was eventually unbanned in 2019 and finally given a classification in 2022, which means it can now be enjoyed by our German Brüder und Schwestern. I apologize to the entire nation of Germany for that pronunciation. Number 8. The Punisher. Anyone who's familiar with Marvel character Punisher will know that the anti-hero is willing to resort to some rather extreme stuff, torture and murder included, in order to clean up the streets. So it probably wouldn't come as much of a shock to Punisher fans that any media starring the skull-wearing, mafia-hating veteran would be a bit violent. Alas, a shock it was to some, and so here we are. 2005's The Punisher is a third third-person action-adventure game in which the titular character takes on various crime organizations, generally with quite visceral results. In fact, so gruesome were some of the scenes of torture and murder that the ESRB initially gave The Punisher an adults-only rating, forcing the developers to tone things down somewhat in order to make sure stores would be willing to carry the game. It wasn't just the USA who was up in arms about The Punisher either. The UK, Australia, and Germany also weren't too pleased with the graphic violence. Further amendments had to be made to the game before the BBFC would give it an 18 classification, the ACB demanded 2 scenes be removed altogether, and in Germany, The Punisher was placed on a list of media deemed harmful to young persons. It's ironic, really, that this game was the main one getting punished here. Number 7. South Park: The Stick of Truth. If you've ever seen an episode of South Park, you know that series creators Trey Parker and Matt Stone aren't ones to shy away from controversy. So when it was announced the series would be getting its very own RPG, scandal was anticipated. South Park: The Stick of Truth sees player character The New Kid moving to the eponymous Quiet Mountain town and becoming embroiled in the gang's epic role-play fantasy war, all of which centers on the titular Stick of Truth. This is South Park, though, so if you go in expecting something akin to Lord of the Rings, you're going to be in for quite a shock. Over the course of the game, players in a region where the title can be purchased uncensored will bear witness to alien anal probing, Nazi zombies, and even an interactive abortion. Jesus Christ. Unsurprisingly though, many of these scenes had to be removed, and if you're playing Stick of Truth in places like Australia or here in the UK, you'll instead be greeted with a crying koala bear or a statue covering its face. Whilst Parker and Stone did fight the censorship, however, they were able to use it to their advantage, taking the opportunity to mock the censors. Good for them, I suppose. Number 6. Bully. Yes, you probably assumed we'd be getting at least one visit from our chums at Rockstar Games sooner or later. But whilst the gaming giant is known for ruffling a few feathers, on this occasion, the public's fears were entirely unfounded. Prior to the release of Bully, Rockstar's 2006 title about a boy named Jimmy Hopkins who goes to a private school and begins taking on the institution's tormentors, Florida-based since disbarred lawyer Jack Thompson began a smear campaign against the game. He'd long been a thorn in Rockstar's side, having harassed them constantly over the content of the Grand Theft Auto series, but now he had a bee in his bonnet about Bully, believing wrongly that it would teach kids to be bullies. His concerns got the attention of the media, and before long, everyone and their dog was reporting on this new bullying simulator, convinced it would train children how to flush their peers' heads down the toilet and perform wedgies. Owing to Thompson's ill-informed rhetoric, Bully was condemned before it was even released. When it did release, however, the truth came out, and all of the naysayers looked mighty stupid. Don't judge a game by its title, okay guys? Especially here in the UK, where it had to be released with a really stupid alternate title, which I've got to imagine probably hampered the game's sales. Who on earth would buy a game called Canis Canem Edit? Number 5. Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2. Considering how long the Call of Duty franchise has been around for, and the fact that the series' focus is squarely on shooting people, you'd think it would have had a whole bunch of controversies under its belt by now. But generally speaking, COD is fairly unscandalous. The one controversy it does have though, oh geez, it's a doozy. Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2, released in 2009, sees Captain Soap McTavish and the gang attempting to hunt down Russian ultranationalist Vladimir Makarov. To do this, an American soldier, Private First Class Joseph Allen, is embedded in Makarov's ranks and to maintain his cover must participate in a terrorist attack on a Russian airport. It was this that proved to be a hair too far for the general public, many of whom were outraged at the fact that Modern Warfare 2 allowed players to participate in terrorism. Following the backlash, the game was censored in several countries. In Russia, the level was removed entirely, and in Japan and Germany, players received a game over screen if they murdered any civilians. Modern Warfare 2 didn't get away scot-free elsewhere either. Many folks in other countries called for its ban or censorship, and it was slapped with very high content ratings in most places where it was released. Number 4. Hatred. We said in the intro of this video that we wouldn't be including games that purposefully set out to offend, but there are probably some that would argue that Hatred is a game that fits that bill. However, its creator claims the game was developed as a response to the political correctness in gaming at the time, rather than to be purposefully offensive, so we'll give it a pass here. We will, however, also point out that said creator allegedly holds neo-Nazi and anti-Islam beliefs, so regardless of his intentions with Hatred, if true, he is still a massive POS. Anyway, in Hatred, players are cast as a misanthrope referred to only as the antagonist, and their goal is to simply move from level to level, eradicating as many human beings as possible. Naturally, due to its severely violent content, Hatred was immediately slapped with an adults-only rating by the ESRB, and when it was submitted for release on Steam, Valve initially pulled it, though they've since backtracked on this. In addition, several publications condemned the game prior to its release for its portrayal of wanton violence and predicted that it would be controversial. Perhaps the worst thing about Hatred, though, is the fact that it's not even very good. Number 3. The Postal series. Long before Hatred was even a twinkle in an alleged massive bigot's eye, the Postal series was upsetting law-abiding, upstanding folks left, right, and centre. Indeed, we've got multiple games for the price of one in this entry due to the fact that each addition to the Postal franchise has been met with disdain from a variety of sources. It's perhaps the first Postal in which a man by the name of Postal Dude goes on a killing spree in the fictional town of Paradise, Arizona that caught the most flack, however. Not only was it lambasted for its violent content and anti-law enforcement messaging, but it was also partially blamed, alongside the likes of Doom, Quake, and Duke Nukem 3D, for the Columbine Massacre, a tragic school shooting that resulted in the deaths of 15 high school students and teachers, along with many more injuries. Now, whilst Postal certainly didn't cause the Columbine Massacre, there are some who argue that the perpetrators got some of their ideas from the game. Whether or not this is the case, though, with such violent, misanthropic content, it's not impossible to see why some people might draw such conclusions. On balance, evidence seems to point to the fact that video games do not cause violence, but games like Postal certainly do cause ill will against the medium from people who don't really understand it. Number 2. Manhunt. More from Rockstar now, though this time we can't help but feel that those who had an issue with this game might have been a little justified in their outrage. Not entirely, after all, as said, it's been proven time and again that video games do not cause real-world violence, but we can at least see where folks were coming from with this one. In Manhunt, players take on the role of protagonist James Earl Cash, a man who is promised his freedom in exchange for committing increasingly grisly murders for the entertainment of rich douchebags. Manhunt is by and large a stealth game, but the problem was that it encouraged players to commit murders in horribly violent and graphic ways. Outrage followed the game at every turn, and it was even linked to the murder of 14-year-old Stefan Pekira at the hands of his 17-year-old friend Warren LeBlanc. Of course, again, the game was not responsible for Pekira's death, but that didn't stop the general public from pointing the finger of blame in its direction and demanding it be removed from sale permanently. Some UK retailers did just this, with Game and Dixon's both refusing to stock it, and several countries around the world, including New Zealand, Australia, and Germany, ended up outright banning the title. And yes, in case you're wondering, its sequel, Manhunt 2, was also subjected to numerous bans. And number 1, Mortal Kombat. We've seen a lot of controversial games on today's list, or I sure hope we have, that's what it's about after all, but not one has been so scandalous, so maligned by the general public, that it literally forced the industry to impose regulations and guidelines upon itself. All except for 1992's Mortal Kombat, that is. Unless you've been living under a rock for the past 30 years, you will know that Mortal Kombat is a series of fighting games where the aim is to best an opponent and then take them down with gory finishing moves known as fatalities. It's rather standard fare these days, and over time the games have even been celebrated for the increasingly creative ways in which players can dispatch combatants. But when the first game was released in 1992, everyone from parents to politicians were up in arms. Nothing so violent had ever graced the medium before, and there were concerns that the games industry was attempting to corrupt the youth. So in order to avoid government regulation, the industry as a collective founded the Entertainment Software Ratings Board, aka the ESRB, which would be responsible for slapping games with age ratings, and still is to this day. So, if you've ever been unable to buy a game because the rating says you're too young, you have indirectly got Mortal Kombat and one or two other titles released around the same time to thank for that. So come on, everyone together, thanks Mortal Kombat. Oh, hang on, don't be too sarcastic. It's a pretty violent game we're talking to here.